I'm really interested in finding out from the two of you, since you've both been researching and thinking about AI since I think long before it was so much in the public consciousness, or maybe two prongs to this: the impact it has on journalists and how they are able to do their jobs, or how it affects their jobs, and then the impact on the news consuming public. So I wonder if maybe we could go the journalism side first. I'm going to read you a quote here that was in a CNN story recently. Google is developing an artificial intelligence tool for news publishers that can generate article text and headlines, highlighting how the technology may soon transform the journalism industry. The tech giant said in a statement it is looking to partner with news outlets on the AI tools use in newsrooms. Part of me looks at that and feels like, hey, this could be really good. Part of me looks at this and says, uh-oh. How do you guys see that?
Well, I'll start. I guess there's several things going on here. First, this is not new, especially regarding Google. Google was part of the Radar project, which is robots and news that was in the UK. And so Google actually was part of that larger project in which they were taking news stories within the United Kingdom and tailoring them more than localizing them with the use of artificial intelligence. And so there's two different types of artificial intelligence at play here. There is the type of AI that's more rule-based, trained. You put in data. It's trained on scripts that journalists have written, and then it gives something out. And that is what, for example, the Associated Press was doing before generative AI. That's how AI has been working. And then there's generative AI, which is different, and works off of works a different way, and it has more flexibility because of that. And so really, when we talk about AI, we have to, and there's all different other types of AI being used in the newsroom as well. And so this is more of a progression. I think it's what is surprising people is more the generative AI aspect.
Yeah, and for the unfamiliar, that's the G in Chat GPT, correct? Is
Yes.
generative. So
yes, and David can expand upon that. Yeah,
generative pre-trained transformer. There we go. That's right. Okay, so it is the generative part. The real heart of that technology is the transformer part of it, which, as Andrea pointed out, is different from the symbolic reasoning, good old-fashioned AI that we had in the decades prior to the development of the generative systems that we're looking at currently.
Yeah, so essentially the other systems had more involvement from humans in terms of designing the systems. And, really, they were still more tightly controlled in terms of what they did relative to, you could only do so much with an AI system around journalism that was content-based. It depended on how you built it. Whereas generative AI, because it's pulling from a larger learning database and is changing as it goes, has a lot more applications to it, I think, is the easiest way to put it.
Yeah,
David,
I'm remembering years ago, I think AP was experimenting with baseball box scores and writing stories from that. And that was basically AI just in its primitive form, I guess, huh?
Yes. Yeah.
So prior to the generative AI that we currently are concerned with, the AIs that were being used in journalism content creation were really two products, one from narrative science and the other one from automated insights. Narrative science is in Chicago, automated insights is in Durham, North Carolina, both spun out of universities, obviously. And they were template-based systems where you could have some preformed templates that would then be used as a story that you could just plug in data, kind of like a form letter of sorts. But it was dynamic. They could choose different templates on the fly, et cetera. And these were being used for a lot of the routine reporting for sports originally, but also financial data and some very basic kinds of event reporting that is oftentimes part of any kind of newspaper. And they had a good decade run. They were very successful, very popular. They were used by the Big Ten networks. They were used by Forbes. They were being used all over the place. And the generative stuff kind of came out of nowhere in this last year to sort of just overturn all of this. And as Andrea said, with the generative AI, you get some greater flexibility, but you also get some greater risk because there is not as much human oversight and there's not as much human control over what is generated as that content. And so even though you get some nice creativity built into it that you didn't have with the previous platforms, you do have a lot of onus put on the editorial process in terms of fact checking and really cleaning up the content that these things spit out.
Do you find that to be kind of a dangerous combination with the fact that there are so many fewer journalists working these days, and then more of this content being created artificially that may not have much oversight before it gets published?
So I think the real concern is in cases where people think they can use the automation without the human oversight. And there are places in which we're looking at cost cutting that may go so deep as to eliminate a lot of the human oversight or the significant portion of the human oversight that could expose us to some either misinformation, some hallucinations, as they're called, out of the large language models, or just some factual errors that inevitably will occur in the process of generating content.
Yeah, and I guess it's any system like this is only as good as what you're feeding it, right? And so there's going to be questions about what gets accessed and where information comes from, or what the volume of information is that it's drawing from, right?
Right. So
yeah, this is complicated.
This is where it gets really complicated. So if we were talking about more the first kind of form that the AP was using, yes, for sure. Because if you're giving it data and how those templates are put together, then yes. Where it's really difficult with generative AI is the amount of data that it's informed from is massive. And we don't know where it's coming from. The other thing is, and this is where people really trip up with it. Like I've heard people say, well, I use generative AI to do research. I ask it a question and it gives me an answer back. And I've done research as if it's given them a fact. No, it's not. The way those models work, to put it simply, is they look at probability of words appearing next to one another. And so what happens there is it's not just, is the data good or bad in there, right? It just comes down to, for example, how much information about, like, let's say a particular group of people is in there, right? And is it right or is it wrong? But then it also has to do with then not only what data is in there, but then how the model puts it together and spits it out.
The best way to think about it is the large language models like ChatGPT don't know or don't care about facts. What it cares about is how things sound. Mm-hmm. Does it sound good?
Right.
Do the words in this order sound good? And therefore, it will put out things that sound good, but aren't necessarily true. So that's one big difference with these new models. Another big difference is the fact that they're only as good as the most recent set of training data. So the pre-training part, the P in ChatGPT, refers to the fact that these are trained on large data sets, but those data sets are limited. They're huge, but they have a cutoff point. And so ChatGPT only has the textual data available to it off the internet up through about 2021. Mm-hmm. So things that have been written since 2021 and posted online are not in its database. It doesn't even have a database. It's not in its training data. And so we need to be concerned not only about the way that it arranges the words in this sort of statistically sounds good pattern, but we need to be worried about the limitations of the big data that we are using for pre-training these things to begin with.
Yeah, I would assume too that that sort of data set would be heavily biased toward English. Would that be accurate? So that you're maybe getting a less a smaller slice of the world's knowledge here and a more biased, westernized look?
Yeah, yes.
Go ahead.
Essentially, but we don't know. So that's part of it. We don't know.
Yeah.
That's a big part. Now, people have tried to kind of query it, researchers who are interested in this, and what they're seeing based on the queries, kind of looking for these types of things, have seen that, yes, it does tend to have more of a bias in certain areas. It also, there's also this fact that the company has put some what we call guardrails on it. In other words, there's certain type of queries that are known to be problematic with people behaving badly. And so it's clear that in some instances, they put some guardrails on it. I'll give you a great example. I was one of the ways I think about is, how do people react to the use of ChatGPT? And one of the most emotional types of stories we tell as journalists involve death, right? And so I was seeing like, hey, ChatGPT, can you write an obit? And it wrote an obit, but then I was like, can you write an obit about someone who was murdered? And it said something to the effect of, let's focus on the positive, not the negative. Like, it didn't want to go there, but there's a hack around that. You can ask it hypothetically. And once you use that word hypothetically, if someone were, what would it look like? Boom, it'll do it. So so they've built some guardrails, but then there's ways around those guardrails as well.
I guess that gets me to a question of journalists using this. There's going to be some hacks, like you said, where you're able to really get a lot out of this if you use it ethically and correctly, right?
Yeah, I think it's what's really helpful when it comes to artificial intelligence and journalism. Several things to consider. One, it's not just all generative AI. It's not just ChatGPT, right? For example, you can use AI to transcribe interviews. You can, there's a lot of other uses that we don't pay attention to that we need to. It's not that they're necessarily nefarious, but we also should be including in the picture because then it gives us a much different holistic picture of what artificial intelligence is doing. And then there's also in terms of how are they using it? So a lot of the focus and a lot of the concern is when, some of the things CNET did early on, some of the problematic aspects where people gave it story ideas or fed it some facts and just kind of took what it returned. But for example, journalists can take their own writing, what they've done, and put it into ChatGPT and see how it refines it. You can use it to create leads. You can, so there's a lot positively that can be done with it. It depends on what you're specifically doing with it. And do you understand what you're doing with it is the other thing here.
Yeah, I just say oftentimes we think of this as kind of monolithic, like it is the AI. There's not the AI. There are numerous instances of AI that can be implemented in journalism and other content creation activities. And ChatGPT gets all the press because it is new and exciting and it has some problems that people are worried about. But there's image generation, there's video generation, there is, as Andrea said, transcription, translation. All of these are forms of AI that have been used and are being used by journalists. And if we're not specific about what AI we want to talk about, we kind of fall into the trap of thinking that we're talking about all these things simultaneously. And I think we need to be really concrete and focused on what exactly are we talking about, what is the tool, and how is it being used, or how can it be used?
Yeah, you mentioned the image creation. I've looked at DALL-E. Is that what it's DALLE?
Yeah.
Again, I kind of come back to this fact that there are fewer gatekeepers in journalism, so there aren't very many photo editors anymore. And wow, there's that ability to create an image that looks very real. And I just wonder if we get people whose sense of ethics are not there, is that going to become a big problem? And, I think it already is in terms of recognizing whether an image has been manipulated or not, right?
So we've already been here with Photoshop. I mean,
Yeah.
images have already been manipulated digitally with those applications. But even before that time, the history of photography is the history of manipulation of photographic evidence in one shape, form, or another. And the reality that is evident to us in a photograph is already a manufactured kind of idea or a manufactured image of someone's perception of a reality. This just amps it up to the next level. And I think when you see the generative AI stuff being used well in journalism, it's when they use the image generation tool to create some kind of fictional image that is then identified as such, so that we know this is generated by the AI. Where you run into trouble is when people start to use these things to create deep fakes. And it's really easy to make deep fake with DALL-E or Midjourney. And it is the pressure on the consumer then to try to decide what is the photographic evidence of a reality versus a manufactured fiction that's generated by the AI. And so we see a shift from some gatekeeping on the side of the photo editor to critical consumption on the side of the user.
Yeah, and Jim, as someone who used to work in the Herald News where I used to work had a massively large newsroom. It's not that anymore. And I think, a lot of people who are part of NINA have seen all of this type of change. So I hear you when you say, what happens when we have less gatekeepers? There's a question of how do we as journalists make sense of this to make sure we're not reusing images, right? When we don't have as much time, you have, instead of 3 people in a photo department, you have one who's not only creating images, but then is also supposed to find images, right? And how much bandwidth does that person have? And then you also have, what happens, unfortunately, we've had some people in our profession who are unscrupulous, and have engaged, already going back to the Photoshop discussion, right? Within these problematic ways. And so I think this is where, making sure that the field, the people in the field are cognizant of what's going on, to kind of watch out for these things, because journalists are pretty good at policing themselves. And other photogs are really, they're well-trained, at this, but there's going to be a learning curve. And I think that's where a lot of frustration relies now, is that there's a learning curve, and journalists who are still practicing are barely hanging on by a thread anyway. And so I think, the fact that there is a learning curve, and how do we make that more accessible to journalists so they can kind of understand what's going on, when really all of us, because we're also seeing this in teaching, in education, right? We were doing things one way one day, ChatGPT came along, and now everyone's, got some issues. So, yeah.
Well, I was thinking too that the public's understanding of what a journalist has gotten a whole lot looser as well. And so there is so much information out there that people trust that is not trustworthy, and journalists kind of get lumped into that big amalgamation of information. And so I think, like you said, we're very ripe for deep fakes, for misinformation, disinformation, and sorting all that out. I want to get to that in a second too, when we talk about kind of how this impacts the public. Can we talk a little bit first though about working journalists who might watch this? What's the expectation for how AI is going to change their roles, their jobs? And no one knows, of course, because it's changing on a daily basis here. But what would you guys expect things to look like in a year, in 2 years?
Yeah. So I think, the one thing I'm going to say, and I know some of the journalists who are around for this the first time, like I was, are going to groan and just maybe want to run from the room, but expect something magnitude of internet or higher. When we saw what happened with the internet, and what we do today almost everything we do today is utterly and completely different than what we were doing pre-internet, right? Or even during that transition period. So that's where we are going to end up. The question is always, how do we get there and where are we going? And right, I mean, that's always the big question. And I think we're going to start to see some changes in terms of daily routines as journalists become more comfortable with it, finding things that they can allocate to AI, and then finding things that where they're needed, right? So it's going to be this process of figuring out, what can I use AI for? How can AI help me? And what can't I use AI for? And really reshifting and thinking about what needs the human and what doesn't need as much. I mean, and so I think that's what we're going to see for the next 2 years, is a lot of figuring out of efficiencies as far as that goes. I also sit on the an advisory board for the Institute of Public Relations. And I can tell you that PR practitioners on the other side of this also are wrestling with these questions, but they come at it from a different perspective. So one kind of interesting thing that's being done is some companies are using AI to figure out what sort of questions journalists will ask them. So they're feeding previous stories that journalists have written into generative AI and saying, hey, what type of questions may come back out? And so that's another thing, right? That also has to be dealt with, is that our stakeholders are also using artificial intelligence. Politicians are using artificial intelligence, or they will be, really quickly. Public relations practitioners are using artificial intelligence. So there's going to also have to be a new kind of understanding worked out, I think, between public relations practitioners and journalists as to how are we labeling things as well. So I think we're going to have to see that really a good hard look at roles and relationships between and among the different media industries also have to evolve.
So we reach a where we're using AI to talk to someone else who's using AI. And sorry, go ahead, David.
So, I think the discussion that gets the sort of popular attention is the "am I going to lose my job" discussion, right? This kind of job displacement, the whole notion of technological unemployment, which we get from John Maynard Keynes, and I think if you look at the sort of progression of technology and its entry and adoption by different industries, you see it's never really simply replacement, but it's more about shuffling the deck and moving things around and displacing some labor to the machine and then reallocating some new roles to the human, et cetera. So what you're seeing right now, not only in journalism, but you're seeing it in other content creation areas, like you are seeing right now with the strike in Hollywood and the Hollywood writers and their conflict with the studios. You're seeing it with musicians as they are trying to figure out how to use generative AI to create music. You're seeing it in the visual arts. You're seeing it all over the place. And what we're trying to really figure out together, in real time, is how we collaborate with these new tools and which ones are the ones that are going to build those efficiencies into our process and which ones are going to shift our attention from what we thought was our job to a different set of concerns and a different set of skills maybe that are necessary as we move forward. So I think in the next year, you're going to see a lot of experimentation at different scales, some very large, some very small. You're already seeing the big players like the New York Times and the LA Times starting to integrate this technology. Smaller operations are just moving in that direction now. But we're seeing, I think, this experimentation going on as we try to sort of figure out what is the right mix of human involvement and technological contribution. And I don't know that anyone has that right answer just yet, but I think the smart money is on kind of, we need to be open-minded and we need to be able to enter into kinds of experimentation that allows for us to discover together what these new opportunities and these new challenges are going to be as we move forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I would to that I would add, it depends on the news organization. So a lot of times we talk about AI and its effect, in these broad sweeping terms. But news organizations vary greatly. So you've always had like the New York Times, the AP, the bigger players who could invest in this. Now, I will say the AP is doing a great job and really trying to think about local news and think about like how can we help to bridge and provide support. They're hosting webinars. I would really pay attention to AP's outreach because they're hosting webinars. They're trying to kind of serve as a thought leader for journalists across the board. But I think this question looks a little bit different depending on what type of news organization and its history, right? So I think this looks really differently for legacy news organizations, versus maybe something that's more of like a nonprofit news organization, because we're also looking at how does technology intersect with the economic model. And so much gets blamed on technology that really has to do with economic decisions being made by owners, shareholders. And so AI, for people who may be working in more legacy systems where it's been cut because they keep on getting sold to, they don't even know who owns them this week, right? May look very different and have concerns very different than maybe someone who's in a nonprofit who's like saying like, yeah, we've never had a lot of money. We've always only had 2 journalists. And now we can use artificial intelligence to bolster, right? So I think there also has to be some rethinking of within some more of those legacy newsrooms of, okay, how do we even retool our thinking about how we serve our communities? What does that look like? And sometimes it's really hard, right? Like when you're in a newsroom that, yes, you may have some local control, but then there's all these layers above you, coming down. So that's a negotiation that has to happen. And I think it's really difficult for journalists. I think I feel for it's hard, particularly where you're situated. The worst thing that could happen is that we get frustrated by it, or we say we don't know where this is going and we ignore it. Because we've done that before. It was called the internet. It was called blogs. And when we saw, and part of this, hindsight's always 2020, right? But we also saw traditional forms of journalism just flat out ignore blogs, flat out ignore what people were saying, what the audience was saying. And this is a huge piece that's missing in research and also goes missing in the conversation quite a bit is, what do audiences think? What do audiences want? How do audiences understand this? And I'm not even talking about like the question, we'll get to this about misunderstanding and fake news, but what do your stakeholders want in terms of, yeah, I want my news written by a human, or, I actually prefer to get these scores. I don't care how they come in. So that's fine. But, if grandma dies, I want a human writing about it, And so that also has to be part of the conversation is it's not just what can we, but what should we? And that's probably going to evolve quite a bit as actually people get more and more used to it too. Initially people may say like, I want all my news written by a human. But research shows most people can't tell the difference either. So, a
lot of our Nina newsrooms are small and
right.
They're, this is not on people's front burner. They're trying to cover the community with an impossible small number of people. Right. So what would be something that someone who works in a very small newsroom might just try in the next few months with AI to just put their toe in the water and see, could this help me?
Well, I think there's some things, in terms of what are mundane tasks that we could offload to the AI. For example, I know, translation, transcription, you have to be careful, but I mean, that can be helpful, right? I think that can really save you a lot of time. And, anytime you can get time back is really helpful. I think a lot of times what we do is, we present information differently across different channels. So, we no longer write for online or a newspaper or just for the broadcast, because now we also have to push out social media. So I think, one way we can start to use AI is to take a story we've written. You can put it into ChatGPT and ask it to bullet point key points. You got to be careful what it throws back at you, but a lot of that's fairly good, right? And you're going to have a quick way of knowing, yes, I wrote about this city council meeting. I'm going to know fast if ChatGPT makes something up when it bullets it. And actually, this is one of the suggestions is we can't be at every meeting anymore, right? We can't. And one of the uses, you still kind of got to watch it a bit, is to take meeting minutes that we don't have time to necessarily read all the way through, and have them, digest it, and bring something out of it. You still have to give it some oversight, but even those little things that normally would take us a while, because they use up brain space, right? I mean, I think as a journalist, we've also all come back from a meeting or come back from covering something. We sit down to write and our brain is just done. So, I think that also, in terms of, here's some notes, create a lead, just to get your brain juices going. And so I think using it as a type of writing partner, I think a lot of people are using it this way. And this is actually one of the ways we're going to be teaching our students how to use it, is how can it be a writing partner? And if you're using your own information, instead of asking ChatGPT to come up with the information, then we're not dealing as much with the hallucination. There can still be some weird quirks, but you're going to see those. So I would really just say, experiment with things such as, can it write me a tweet? And yes, I call them tweets still. Can it write me, this, a lead in, just seeing what little bits can be automated, not only to save time, but really to help with that mental load. Because that's one thing that's really hard about being a journalist right now is the mental load when you are the person who's covering, so thinking about what sort of things can I offload, would be my suggestion. And those are some of the suggestions also coming out of the people doing the research on this.
I remember when the internet was new and I was just new as advising the Northern Star, and the newspaper industry in particular was really looking at universities and new students graduating as being the people who knew what they were talking about with this stuff. Do you think that's going to repeat with AI, or do you think that looks different going forward?
I think, and it's not just the news industry, this is also the PR industry. Because one of the questions that's being asked is, a lot of the tests that, when I went in back in the day, right, and I took my newsroom test, it was in paper, right, that editing test and things like that. But now it's done remotely. And there's a question of like, can we even do that anymore? Do we have to actually go back to in person for when we're vetting people to work for us? So that's one end of it. But traditionally, I think several things happen. Particularly with technology, I think a lot of times multiple industries just look to the younger generation because they see them as being more technology savvy. And so I do think that expectations for journalism training are going to change. Now, the good thing at NIU is I've been teaching my students artificial intelligence since 2015 when I showed up. And in terms of what it is, what it can do, what it can't do, and the ethics of it. And so I think we're also going to have to think about journalism training. We're going to have to think about maybe some retraining like we had with the internet, like we had with social media with existing journalists, but also what does journalism education look like right now? It's a question we're asking ourselves.
Yeah.
I think another thing you get with a younger generation of recent graduates isn't just their exposure to these technologies, hopefully through their course that they take and their curriculum, but you have a mind that is fresh, that is
Mhm.
not locked into a certain way of doing things from years of experience. That's often seen as something bad. They don't have the experience, but they also have this ability to really hit the ground running and enthusiastically embrace something that is a little perhaps risky, a little sensitive, a little problematic, but actually, their minds are really fresh and open to this experimentation that we're talking about. And so I think one of the things we get from young people is not only the sets of skills we're looking for, but also the attitude to, hit the ground running and saying, what can this do? How can I integrate this? And what things can I learn in the process? And so I think there's a lot to be gained by really helping our students not only build the skill set when they're in the university courses, but also to cultivate that kind of sense of experimentation and that open-mindedness so that when they do get out in the workforce, they're the ones who can really lead as we move forward.
I wonder about that when we think about journalists, or any walk of life, where I think maybe as you're older, the first response is a little bit of fear toward a topic like this. And not always, but then for a younger mind, it may be more a sense of wonder and what could this do and what are the possibilities? And I know there are older people who think that way, but by and large, I guess that's why we all mix generations and work, and why that works, huh?
Well, I think too, there's always been this question of how do we get younger people to consume news, right? Our news viewership, our news readership is skews older. I think part of the issue is we haven't been listening to the younger journalists who actually are of that generation, because actually students do consume news, but it looks completely different from what we think of consuming news. And so I think really, and this is where I say, one of the oversights with journalism research and even with newsrooms is journalists have a very specific conceptualization of who they are and what they do, and that they know what they're doing and that the audience doesn't know, right? And that's fair, but the audience does know what it wants. And when we see audiences doing certain things, or we see audiences avoiding certain things, there has to be a careful balance of maybe the audience is telling me something, maybe we're missing something here, because there's often this assumption that a technology shows up and it's the technology company that determines how it's used. It's not true. It's the users, right? You can only look at mobile phones. We used to only call on them. Now it's really weird if someone makes a phone call, right? Texting, but that whole push to texting was an adaptation that was user led. And so really looking at trends, keeping aware of trends in what people are doing with technology, how people are consuming news with technology. Like Pew does a great job of this. And not only defining our audience in terms of what it is, but what it could be, I think has been a really big issue too.
There's a really great quote from the cyberpunk author William Gibson, where he says, "The street finds its own use for things the manufacturer never imagined." And I think every technology goes through this. I think when the blog was new, the people who came up with the blogging platforms thought blogs were going to be used for this particular purpose, and then it totally shifted, and we got users employing the blog in ways that were never anticipated by either the manufacturer, by the news organizations, and it totally transformed how that technology was used. And I think we've got to pay attention to what users are doing and what users want, because that is going to help us decide what is the best way to integrate these technologies moving forward.
Maybe that's a good shifting point then, where we talk about the impact of AI on news consumers, and I think we could still keep it as far as how journalists can help consumers be more news literate, be more, whatever term we want to use. But are you seeing things that concern you or give you hope? One of the two, I guess, or maybe both, in terms of how the public is consuming news, and especially as it would relate to AI.
I think one of the big worries when deepfakes began to gain traction was that you were going to have this naive public who would see these deepfakes and believe everything they see and everything they read and everything they hear. And what has actually happened when you look at how people have interacted with these deepfakes is it's created this really intense critical sense of everything they consume that comes through the internet. And that has to be cultivated, obviously, and it can be steered one way or the other. But I think, we shouldn't look at our user base as being somehow this naive, impressionable set of consumers, but rather, they have a set of skills as viewers. Those skills have been learned over years and years of consuming content, whether it be in news or in entertainment. And there are ways in which users are already responding to some of the concerns around deepfakes and around misinformation. It doesn't mean that that's a total solution. It's not a silver bullet, but it does mean that we have, I think, the desire already within users to develop a kind of critical perspective on how they are interacting with their content.
Yeah, I would say one thing that often gets overlooked, even users who we say we fall into the conspiracy theory category, and people tend to try to make jokes about those users. They're critical in the sense of they actually think what they're doing is right. They actually think they're being critical consumers. And this is where the issue lies, is there's massive amounts of information and people know it all can't be true. But the traditional ways of how we used to know whether or not at least something was more associated with being legitimate, it's gone. And the other thing that gets looked over here too is who is sharing the information with you, right? And so there's the AI problem of a deep fake, right? But if let's say I'm a Democrat and I see someone who I know is a Republican sharing a video, I might be like, ooh, is that a deep fake? And vice versa, right? But if it's another Democrat sharing the video or another Republican, insert your favorite political party here, right? We tend not to be as critical. So part of this actually, this is not a technology problem. This is a human problem with how humans process information, right? And it's just now evolved into a new context, and a context where a lot more information is flowing a lot faster. And that's what makes it extremely difficult. So I just want to make clear that we're dealing not just with a technological problem, but with a human problem at the same time. And it's actually that human piece that's really, really hard to deal with, because there are ways to figure out deep fakes with technology. It's the humans passing them along that's the issue. Yeah.
I think history of media technology can be really useful here. It used to be that we distrusted printed material because we couldn't authorize it enough to find out whether or not it was truthful information or not. Same thing happened with the photograph and the integration of photography. And then with the internet, remember this whole time in which people were suspicious of things on the internet and couldn't quote things on the internet because that can't be verified or validated. And I think every time we get a new technology, we have to sort of reinvent not only our critical thinking apparatus, but also our mechanism for distinguishing truth from falsity. And it's not always the same. And as Andrea was saying, this is a human problem. It's not about the technology per se. It's about how we consume our information and make sense of the things that we're consuming in our content. And as a result, it takes a number of years for us to evolve these sorts of ideas about what is truthful and how do we tell what is truthful. And we're at the beginning of a technological disruption that's as big as the printing press. And we need, some time to actually work out socially how we are going to make sense of the content that it makes available to us.
I wonder if that's a little bit of a calming thought to just realize we're in the middle of a revolution, so it isn't always going to feel so unfamiliar or so out of control, but we're learning as we go here, and it doesn't feel good. It feels really uncertain and a little scary sometimes, but it's not going to be that forever. Maybe it will be that forever. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think the issue we're also dealing with here is we had the printing press, we had print for a very long time. And then we had TV come about and we had some time to get used to it. And then we had the internet, and then we had social media, and then we had AI. And those really, if you think about, I mean, when we started to see critical mass with the internet is about 2000, right? 23 years later, and we're dealing with AI, and we have social media shoved in there too, right? So I think that's part of the issue is there have been wave after wave of technology, and that's from the user side and the creator side, but there's been these just waves crashing on top of each other, and so you feel like you're drowning, because you haven't had a chance to really come up for air and figure those things out. As a journalist, it's very frustrating when people tell you're partaking in fake news, right? Or it's very frustrating when people come and show you something that is fake and claims it's true. And I think a lot of journalists are like, what do we do about this? And I think, I'll talk about some concrete steps that can be taken. But I think, again, kind of what you were talking about, Jim, journalists alone won't solve this problem. And journalists shouldn't think that they're the ones. There is a larger societal, there's a larger political, I mean, this is a multi-tiered problem that, again, has very little to do with technology. I mean, it has to do with technology, but it doesn't, right? And so I think that is where journalists really, instead of trying to figure out how they're going to solve all these problems, need to focus on, okay, what is it that we're going to do to meet our audience needs, right? Maybe think about not just like look at the person, be like, oh, this crazy person keeps on giving me this misinformation, and now everyone's looking at it, thinking about like, okay, why were the people seeking out that information in the first place, right? Is it because we don't have anyone covering our school board now? And so as it turns out, people are going to, all these blogs about school boards because they don't have another place to get information about school boards. Okay, yeah. Now we're like, okay, we know this is coming from, let's maybe have some coverage, right? And so I think that's looking at the motivators behind. But one thing I want to talk about while we're on this subject is how journalists cover artificial intelligence and how they talk about artificial intelligence, because this is actually a place where journalists can have important interventions. And it's a place where researchers such as myself have concerns about how journalists themselves are reporting about artificial intelligence, because inadvertently, and for reasons that have to do with, one day someone's writing about a school board, the next day they're writing about a parade, and then the next day they're writing about artificial intelligence, right? Those are three very different things. There's a lot of misunderstanding that's again inadvertently being passed on to the audience. And I think if there's one thing that journalists want to think about is how can we report better on these types of issues and be more careful in our reporting, because when we hype up and we just talk about how deep fakes are going to ruin everything, then the audience takes a message of like, well, I can't believe what I see anymore, right? But if we talk about these are deep fakes, this is how they work, they can be used at scale, but actually these are the types of things you can do to look and find them. Okay, now we're empowering the audience. We're letting them know, hey, this is happening, but actually there's things that you can do. And by the way, these are the things we're doing.
Yeah, I think of it being very similar to when you're helping people deal with phone scams and things like that, and giving them tools, right? Here's how you recognize these types of things. But you're right. I think then you become on the side of your audience rather than some sort of perceived adversary.
And it's a two-way street. Not only do journalists need to have strategies for reporting on this technology and helping audiences understand why it's important and what's happening, but I think also researchers need to learn how to talk to journalists. It's not always something we cover in our graduate education. How do you take your really important research in large language models and deep learning and make it accessible to a wider audience? And there is some work being done in many of the major organizations for researchers, trying to help them become better at interfacing with the public through journalists. And if we both are working on this problem simultaneously, I think you have a meeting point in the middle where we get a better synthesis that we can then utilize for popularizing and publishing this information.
Yeah, I think for example, one of the ways artificial intelligence gets talked about, that researchers have identified as deeply problematic, is what we call through science fiction. Because a lot of times we want to compare robots or artificial intelligence to science fiction, because it does give journalists a sense, or our readers, like, oh, a little bit of a sense if they haven't interacted with it. The problem is the fiction part of that, and kind of this hype. So a lot of times, and there's a line here, right? We want people to read our stories. And then, or listen. We don't want to take all the fun out of it, but there is a line here, in terms of what AI are we even talking about. So this goes back to what David and I were talking about earlier. AI is not AI, and it sure is not the sentient robot taking over. And I think one of the things journalists can do is be, when they're talking about a technology, be very specific as to what that technology does and does not do. And I think just, being a little bit more nuanced in those terms of what can it do, what it can't do. I think another thing is to really think about tech reporting and how there's been a lot of criticism lately, but the fact, like, Apple has a tech launch, news organizations lose their minds, right? They're covering that. There's live blog update. So, but these are companies that need to sell things.
Yeah.
Open AI, right? So this is the other thing, is to say, remember, these are people shilling products. And I'm not saying like they're necessarily acting nefariously, but they're doing one thing. We as journalists are there to question. Yeah. There's not a lot of questioning that goes on in AI reporting.
Probably that is probably hiding the fact that the reporter doesn't know very much about it, right? And that they're feeling overwhelmed and they're talking to somebody who's an expert, and that makes them feel kind of important.
Right. Yeah. And I think this is, and again, at the local level, this is understandable. And for some of the bigger players who've been covering tech for a long time, there is no excuse.
Yeah.
But at the local level, it's harder. Like I said, you're covering a kid's soccer game, you're covering a picnic, you're covering taffy apples and AI. But I think one thing that newsrooms can do, listen, I covered all those in a week once. I used to be the parade reporter. Okay, people know what that is. When possible, in your newsroom, try and have the same person reporting about AI. See, obviously, there's probably not, when we're talking local, semi-local, you can't put someone solely on an AI beat, right? But if you can designate a person in the newsroom who's going to report on it more, we do know that the more you cover something, the more you tend to build up knowledge about it, right?
Yep.
Or other things, if you have someone working in education, someone working in business, someone governing government, you can also maybe look at and create files of, sharing AI resources. Hey, I found this really interesting explainer on AI, or maybe just having conversations about AI.
Yeah, I was thinking just the work of a journalist is a lot related to curiosity. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's so much to learn right now. It's a huge
Right.
opportunity, and a really fun opportunity if you embrace that and then you pass that along to an audience. That's even more fun sometimes. Any final thoughts from either of you? This has been really helpful and good. So I really appreciate the time here.
To not be scared of artificial intelligence, and it's hard. It's frustrating. I think maybe people aren't necessarily scared, but it's frustrating, right? It's frustrating to have to deal with. And thinking about how we can turn that frustration more into an opportunity, and realize being frustrated is not going to make it better. And so how do we move forward and taking control and saying, all right, these technologies are out there, but instead of waiting for our competitors to figure out how to use them, what are we going to do? What are we going to start experimenting with? You don't have to do it all at once either. I think start with the low hanging fruit of, these are maybe some ways we can write or create content that are very small, and just kind of get more used to it, right? And then say, all right, we're also going to find out more information about artificial intelligence. Look, if you guys have questions about it, your audience has questions about it, so write a package about it. Inform yourselves, inform your audience while you're at it, and really listen to consumers, even the most frustrating, who it seems that they're operating off of complete misinformation and disinformation. Say, okay, what does that tell us about how people are finding information? And is there a way we can fill a gap here? But also knowing that what's going on is not entirely the fault of the media, and it's not entirely theirs to correct. So there's a balance.
So I would say, just to follow on that, I'd say, following up on what Jim said earlier, I think being curious is absolutely crucial, to not being afraid.
Right.
And if you're curious, you want to know why. You want to ask questions. You want to see what's possible. And that, I think, is a much healthier way to adjust to and respond to a lot of these disruptions that we see coming from technology. Another thing is, don't do a wait and see. We did that with the internet. We did it with other technologies. Wait and see gets us nowhere. You have to jump in feet first right now and start to play with it and start to work with it and start to see what it can do for you, what it can't do for you, and to figure out where this mix of human and machine is going to be as we move forward. And that's something that's going to happen on the ground. It's not something that's going to come from management. It's going to happen with each individual journalist getting in and working with these technologies and seeing what it can do. And then lastly, I'd say listen not only to the researchers and understand how to report on what they're doing, but also listen to our audiences, listen to what it is our stakeholders need and want from us as communicators, so that we are supplying to them information that is valuable, information that they value, and that is really serving the purpose of what it is we're trying to do as communicators, PR professionals, and journalists.
Well, David, Andrea, I want to thank you both. This has been really, really interesting. I think it's going to be immensely helpful for an audience of journalists who feels a little overwhelmed by it all. So you've helped bring a sense of calm to it. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and it just so your audience out there knows, I regularly, I'm just like, oh my goodness, what's going on now? So I mean, we deal this, in some ways it is uncomfortable to learn about like new things, and constantly, I mean, we constantly feel heaped upon too. So we feel you here.